The frozen courtyard at Dachau fell silent as dawn crept over the Bavarian foothills that February morning in 1943. Steam rose from the breath of the assembled SS officers, their black uniforms stark against the frost-covered concrete. In the center, strapped to a metal chair, a Soviet prisoner of war sat motionless, his bare arm extended and locked into a metal brace, the skin already mottled purple and white from over an hour of extreme cold exposure. Dr. Sigmund Rascher circled him slowly, a small medical hammer in his gloved hand, while behind him a cluster of skeptical Luftwaffe physicians exchanged sideways glances. They had called his methods theatrical, his science questionable, his obsession with frozen flesh nothing more than the delusions of a man desperate for academic recognition. But in the next 3 seconds, that frozen courtyard would witness something that silenced every critic in attendance, the sickening crack of human bones shattering like porcelain, demonstrating to the horrified witnesses just how completely severe cold could transform living tissue into something fragile, something breakable, something utterly destroyed. What you are about to hear is the true story of one of the darkest chapters in medical history. The Nazi freezing experiments conducted at Dachau concentration camp between 1942 and 1943. This is not speculation. This is not dramatization. Every detail you will hear comes from the meticulous records the perpetrators themselves kept, from survivor testimonies, and from evidence presented at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. These experiments would claim the lives of approximately 80 to 100 prisoners, while subjecting 280 to 300 others to suffering that defies description. And at the center of it all stood a man whose ambition, cruelty, and eventual downfall reads like a Greek tragedy written in blood and ice. If this is your first time joining us on this channel, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We release deep dives into history's most compelling and often disturbing stories every week, the kind of stories you won't find in textbooks. To understand how an experiment this brutal could be sanctioned, indeed celebrated, by the Third Reich, we must first understand the man who conceived it. Sigmund Rascher was born in Munich on February 12, 1909, into a family that seemed destined for intellectual pursuits. His father, Hans August Rascher, was a physician and devoted follower of Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher who founded anthroposophy. The young Sigmund attended the very first Waldorf school in Stuttgart, an institution built on Steiner's progressive educational philosophies that emphasize creativity, holistic thinking, and respect for the individual. The irony of a man educated in such principles becoming one of history's most infamous torturers would not be lost on those who later studied his case. At this school, Rascher came under the influence of Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, a researcher who believed in the influence of cosmic rhythms on life processes. It was an environment that valued the mystical alongside the scientific, the spiritual alongside the empirical. Yet somewhere along this path, Rascher's moral compass fractured. Whether it was personal ambition, political opportunism, or some darker deficit in his character, by 1933 he had enrolled in medical school in Munich and joined the Nazi Party. Even this simple act was shrouded in deception. Rascher later claimed he had joined on March 1, 1933, just 4 days before the Nazi victory in the federal election, a date that would mark him as a true believer. Documents, however, showed his actual enrollment came on May 1st, after Hitler had already consolidated power with the Enabling Act. From the very beginning, Rascher understood the power of manipulating the historical record. His medical career progressed unremarkably through the late 1930s. He received his doctorate in 1936, joined the SA, worked briefly on cancer diagnostics under Professor Trump, and served as an assistant physician at Munich's Schwabinger Krankenhaus. By all accounts, he was a mediocre physician with exceptional ambitions, a dangerous combination that would soon find its outlet. The transformation of Sigmund Rascher from obscure doctor to instrument of mass murder hinged on a single relationship: his connection to Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, the man who commanded the entire SS apparatus and oversaw the concentration camp system. This connection came not through Rascher's own achievements, but through his wife, Caroline Diehl, a former singer 15 years his senior. The precise nature of Diehl's relationship with Himmler has never been fully established. Some historians suggest she was a former lover. What is certain is that she maintained regular correspondence with the Reichsfuhrer and frequently interceded on her husband's behalf. In 1939, Rascher transferred to the SS with the initial rank of private. That same year, he made a decision that would haunt historical analyses of his character forever. He denounced his own father to the Nazi authorities. Within a week of his first personal meeting with Himmler, Rascher presented a paper with the obsequious title, "Report on the Development and Solution to Some of the Reichsfuhrer's Assigned Tasks," during a discussion held on April 24, 1939. He had found his patron, and in Himmler he had found a man whose combination of mystical beliefs and ruthless pragmatism created the perfect environment for Rascher's experiments to flourish. The freezing experiments that would make Rascher notorious did not begin in the ice tanks. They began in the thin air of simulated altitude. In early 1941, while taking a course in aviation medicine in Munich, Rascher wrote a letter to Himmler that would set in motion years of systematic torture. The letter was direct, almost casual in its horror. Rascher explained that his course included research into high-altitude flight, and that it was regretted no tests with humans had been possible. Such experiments were highly dangerous, and nobody volunteered for them. He noted that previous tests conducted on monkeys had been unsatisfactory. Then he asked Himmler a simple question: could prisoners be made available for these experiments? The answer, delivered through Himmler's adjutant Rudolf Brandt, was yes. By the spring of 1942, a portable low-pressure chamber supplied by the Luftwaffe had been installed at Dachau concentration camp. Inside this chamber, prisoners could be exposed to conditions simulating altitudes of up to 68,000 feet, more than twice the height of Mount Everest, well into the death zone where no human being could survive without specialized equipment. The purpose, ostensibly, was to understand what happened to Luftwaffe pilots who were forced to eject at extreme altitudes. The reality was a series of experiments that combined scientific curiosity with absolute sadism. Victims were locked inside the chamber while the interior pressure dropped rapidly, simulating a pilot's free fall from altitude without oxygen. Some experiments simulated slow descents, others mimicked rapid decompression, the kind a pilot might experience if his cockpit was breached by enemy fire at 30,000 feet. Through small windows in the chamber, observers watched as prisoners went through predictable stages of oxygen deprivation. First restlessness, then headaches, then cramps, then unconsciousness, then death. In a letter dated April 5, 1942, Rascher described one such experiment to Himmler with clinical detachment. The victim was a 37-year-old man, described as being in good health before being sealed in the chamber. At 4 minutes without oxygen, the man began wiggling his head. A minute later, Rascher observed the onset of cramps, followed rapidly by unconsciousness. The victim then lay unconscious, breathing only 3 times per minute, until respiration stopped entirely 30 minutes after oxygen deprivation began. The man's skin turned blue. Foam appeared at his mouth. An autopsy followed 1 hour later. Rumors circulated among those who knew of these experiments that Rascher performed vivisections on victims who survived the initial pressure tests, cutting into their brains while they still lived to observe the effects of altitude on neural tissue. Whether these rumors were true or not, the documented outcomes were horrific enough. Of the 200 subjects forced into the low-pressure chamber, 80 died immediately from the experiments. The remaining 120 were murdered afterward, many of them executed specifically so that autopsies could be performed, while the physical effects were still fresh. Himmler's response to these reports was not disgust, but enthusiasm. On April 13, 1942, he wrote back to Rascher with new orders. The high-altitude experiments should continue, and Rascher should focus specifically on tests to determine whether subjects who had lost consciousness could be recalled to life. If any condemned man was successfully resuscitated, Himmler wrote, he should be pardoned to concentration camp for life. This was Nazi mercy. Survival meant not freedom, but endless imprisonment. Rascher replied to Himmler expressing concern that this policy might create problems. The victims to date, he noted, had been merely Poles and Russians. He believed they should be given no amnesty of any sort. It was in late 1942, after the high-altitude experiments concluded, that Rascher turned his attention to the cold. The German military situation in 1942 was increasingly desperate. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was learning a brutal lesson that Napoleon had learned 130 years earlier. The Russian winter was an enemy no army had ever truly conquered. German soldiers, equipped for a quick summer campaign, were dying not from Soviet bullets, but from exposure to temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees. Pilots downed in the North Sea faced a similar fate. The frigid waters could render a man unconscious in minutes and eliminate him within the hour. The German High Command desperately needed data on how the human body responded to extreme cold and, more importantly, how frozen soldiers might be revived. Rascher saw opportunity. With Himmler's blessing, he began a new series of experiments at Dachau that would subject approximately 300 prisoners to deliberate hypothermia. The ostensible scientific goal was twofold: to determine the lowest body temperature at which a frozen subject could be revived, and to discover the most effective rewarming method. The actual result was mass murder conducted with meticulous record-keeping. The first method involved large vats of ice water installed in the experimental barracks. Victims, selected from among the healthiest young prisoners, primarily Jews and captured Soviet soldiers, were stripped naked or dressed in Luftwaffe flight suits. An insulated probe was then inserted into the victim's rectum to measure internal body temperature. The probe was held in place by an expandable metal ring that opened inside the rectum, ensuring accurate readings would be possible, even as the victim convulsed and struggled. The prisoner was then lowered into water, cooled to temperatures between 2 and 12 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. The ice baths proved to be the most efficient method for rapidly lowering body temperature. Rascher documented this efficiency with the clinical precision of a scientist utterly divorced from the humanity of his subjects. Victims were kept submerged for up to 5 hours, though most lost consciousness between 70 and 90 minutes as their core temperature dropped below the threshold of survival. Rascher created what he called exodus tables, the word exodus being the Latin medical term for death, documenting precisely how long it took for victims to expire at various water temperatures. One such table, preserved in the Nuremberg trial records, tells the story in cold numbers. Attempt number 5. Water temperature 5.2 degrees Celsius. Body temperature at removal 27.7 degrees. Body temperature at death 27.7 degrees. Time in water 66 minutes. Time of death 66 minutes. Attempt number 13. Water temperature 6 degrees. Body temperature at removal 29.2 degrees. Body temperature at death 29.2 degrees. Time in water 80 minutes. Time of death 87 minutes. The numbers continued, experiment after experiment, victim after victim, each entry representing a human being who had been slowly frozen to death while Rascher and his assistants watched, measured, and recorded. The second method of inducing hypothermia was, in some ways, even more cruel because of its duration. Prisoners were taken outside during the Bavarian winter, stripped naked, and strapped down in the open air where temperatures dropped as low as -6 degrees Celsius. Unlike the relatively rapid descent into unconsciousness provided by the ice baths, This method of freezing took much longer, up to 14 hours in some cases. Witnesses later testified to the sounds that echoed across the Dachau compound during these experiments, the screaming of men as their bodies froze, pleas for mercy in Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and German, cries that gradually weakened and then stopped entirely as vocal cords themselves succumbed to the cold. Walter Neff, a prisoner who served as an assistant during some of these experiments, forced to participate in order to survive, later provided testimony about what he witnessed. He described the methodical nature of the torture, the way Rascher would periodically check on his outdoor subjects throughout the night, noting temperatures, observing the progression of frostbite across exposed skin, watching as extremities transformed from living flesh to frozen tissue. The experiments continued regardless of weather conditions. Indeed, the colder the night, the more valuable Rascher considered the data. Once victims had been sufficiently frozen, their body temperatures reduced to levels that would be fatal without intervention. The second phase of the experiments began, rewarming. Rascher tested multiple methods, documenting the results with the same meticulous attention he had applied to the freezing process. Hot baths proved the most effective and fastest method for raising body temperature back to survivable levels. But effectiveness came with its own horrors. At least one witness, an assistant during the experiments, later testified that some victims were thrown into boiling water for rewarming. The result was not revival, but additional trauma. The shock of extreme heat on a frozen body produced effects that can only be imagined. Internal organs, already stressed by hypothermia, were further damaged. Tissue that had somehow survived the freezing process was now scalded beyond recovery. Himmler, with his characteristic blend of mysticism and pseudoscience, took a personal interest in the rewarming experiments. He attended several sessions at Dachau and came away with a suggestion that seemed more derived from folklore than medicine. He told Rascher that the doctor should travel to the North Sea region and interview fishermen's wives about traditional methods for warming men pulled from frigid waters. Himmler reportedly said he believed that a fisherwoman could well take her half-frozen husband into her bed and revive him in that manner. He wanted to know whether animal warmth had a different effect than artificial warmth. This suggestion led to what became known as the body heat experiments. 4 Romani women were transported from Ravensbrück concentration camp to Dachau specifically for this purpose. Hypothermic victims were placed between 2 naked women, the theory being that body-to-body contact would transfer heat more effectively, or perhaps more naturally, than a hot bath or heated blankets. The results were documented with the same clinical detachment as the other experiments. The women's bodies treated as warming apparatus, no different from the water tanks or electric blankets also tested. It was in the midst of these experiments that the method that would become infamous emerged, the direct testing of frozen tissue to determine its condition. When a human limb freezes completely, it undergoes profound physical changes. The water in cells crystallizes into ice, expanding as it freezes and rupturing cell walls. Blood vessels become blocked with frozen blood. Tissue that was once flexible becomes rigid, and rigid tissue becomes brittle. Severely frozen limbs share certain physical properties with other frozen organic materials. They can shatter under sudden impact. Rascher became obsessed with determining the exact point at which tissue transformation occurred, the moment when living flesh crossed the threshold into what he called complete freezing. His methods for assessing this state evolved over the course of the experiments. Simple observation proved insufficient. Skin that appeared completely frozen might still contain unfrozen tissue beneath the surface. Traditional medical assessment required warming the limb first, which interfered with the data Rascher was trying to collect. The solution Rascher developed was direct mechanical testing, the application of sudden force to a frozen extremity to determine whether it would bend or break. When senior Luftwaffe physicians first heard of this approach, some dismissed it as unnecessarily crude, the kind of demonstration that belonged in a torture chamber rather than a research facility. Rascher's colleagues mocked him, questioned his methodology, suggested that a doctor of his apparent ambitions was wasting time on what amounted to circus tricks. The criticism stung Rascher, who desperately craved the academic credentials he had been unable to obtain through legitimate means. Then came a demonstration that silenced the skeptics. A Soviet prisoner who had been subjected to prolonged cold exposure, his left arm packed in ice and snow for over an hour while circulation was cut off, was brought before an audience of German military physicians. Rascher approached with a small medical reflex hammer, the same tool neurologists use to test knee-jerk responses. He positioned the hammer above the prisoner's frozen forearm, raised it, and brought it down with moderate force. The arm did not flex, it did not bruise, it shattered. The sound, described by one witness as similar to breaking a thick icicle, was followed by moments of absolute silence. Blood did not flow from the wound because the blood itself was frozen. The prisoner, in severe hypothermic shock, barely responded to what should have been agonizing trauma. He was eliminated shortly afterward, his body autopsied to document the precise extent of tissue damage. The demonstration achieved exactly what Rascher intended. The skeptical physicians no longer questioned his methods. The test became incorporated into the standard protocol for determining the severity of frostbite in experimental subjects. A quick, crude, and devastating assessment tool that revealed the degree of tissue destruction in a way no other method could match. In October 1942, with his freezing experiments ongoing, Rascher was invited to present his findings at a medical conference in Nuremberg. A cruel geographic irony, given that the same city would later host the trials that condemned his work. The conference was titled Medical Problems Arising from Sea and Winter, and Rascher delivered two presentations, Prevention and Treatment of Freezing and Warming Up After Freezing to the Danger Point. The audience consisted of German military physicians, many of whom knew exactly how the data had been obtained. None objected. The data itself was extensive. Rascher had documented the cooling curves of human bodies at various temperatures, the survival times in ice water, the relative effectiveness of different rewarming methods, the physiological changes associated with each stage of hypothermia. On paper, it looked like comprehensive research into a legitimate medical question. Only the source of the data, human beings tortured to death without consent, distinguished it from ethical scientific inquiry. Rascher was eager to convert this data into academic credentials. A habilitation thesis, the advanced qualification required for a university professorship in German academia, seemed within reach. He submitted his research to Munich, then Marburg, then Frankfurt. All three institutions rejected him, not on ethical grounds, but because German academic tradition required that research results be made available for public scrutiny. And the classified nature of Rascher's work made such transparency impossible. The irony was not lost on later historians. The Nazi regime, which had enabled Rascher's experiments, prevented him from gaining the academic recognition he craved because the same secrecy that protected the crimes also blocked their academic exploitation. By 1943, the freezing experiments at Dachau had claimed approximately 80 to 100 lives, with hundreds more survivors carrying the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal. Rascher, meanwhile, had expanded his research portfolio. He began developing improved cyanide capsules, the standard suicide pills carried by high-ranking Nazi officials and intelligence operatives who might be captured by the enemy. His capsules were designed to be easily bitten through, either deliberately or accidentally, ensuring quick and certain death. He tested them on prisoners, of course. He also conducted experiments with polygal, a blood-clotting agent made from beet and apple pectin. The testing methodology was characteristically brutal. Subjects were given polygal tablets, then shot through the neck or chest, or had their limbs amputated without anesthesia. The purpose was to determine whether the tablets could reduce battlefield bleeding. Rascher published a paper on polygal, neglecting to mention that his research subjects had been murdered prisoners. He also established a company to manufacture the substance, staffed by concentration camp inmates. Science, commerce, and atrocity merged seamlessly in Rascher's world. Throughout this period, Rascher's protector remained Heinrich Himmler. The correspondence between the two men reveals a relationship built on mutual exploitation. Himmler provided access to unlimited human subjects and protection from interference. Rascher provided data that supported the regime's war effort, and perhaps more importantly, fed Himmler's pseudo-scientific interests. The Reichsfuhrer was fascinated by racial theories, by the possibility that certain ethnic groups might be inherently more resistant to cold. Some of the freezing experiments specifically targeted Soviet prisoners under the hypothesis that Slavic genetics conferred superior cold tolerance, a theory that Rascher's data neither confirmed nor denied, but which justified additional experiments. The relationship between the Raschers and Himmler extended beyond professional collaboration into personal propaganda. Carolina Rascher, by this point in her late 40s, had allegedly given birth to 3 children, a remarkable feat for a woman her age. Himmler was delighted. The births seemed to confirm Nazi theories about extending the childbearing years of Aryan women through proper living and racial purity. He used photographs of the Rascher family as propaganda material, proof that even aging German women could contribute to the Reich's demographic expansion. It was a lie. During Caroline's 4th pregnancy, she was arrested while attempting to kidnap a baby. The subsequent investigation revealed the truth. None of her children were biologically hers. All 3 had been either purchased or kidnapped from their actual mothers. The Raschers had constructed an elaborate fraud designed to please Himmler and enhance their status within the Nazi hierarchy. The unraveling was swift. In December 1943, Rascher's lab assistant and housekeeper, Julie Muschler, disappeared during a mountain trip with the couple. When her body was found in April 1944, both Raschers came under suspicion of murder. Combined with the baby scandal and evidence of financial irregularities, Rascher's position became untenable. Himmler's response to the betrayal was characteristically ruthless. The man who had once been the Reichsfuhrer's favored scientist was now an embarrassment, proof that Himmler could be deceived and manipulated. There would be no trial, no opportunity for Rascher to explain himself or implicate others. The Raschers were simply disappeared into the concentration camp system they had exploited. Sigmund Rascher was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, then transferred to Dachau, the same camp where he had conducted his experiments, as Allied forces advanced across Germany in early 1945. He was held in a bunker reserved for special prisoners. Caroline was sent to Ravensbrück, the camp that had supplied the Romani women for her husband's body heat experiments. The end came on April 26, 1945, just 3 days before American troops liberated Dachau. An SS officer named Theodor Bongartz approached Rascher's cell, acting on direct orders from Himmler. He shot Rascher through the observation and food delivery door of the cell, then kicked the body with the words, "You pig, now you've got the punishment you deserve." Around the same time, Carolina Rascher was executed by hanging at Ravensbrück. The man who had frozen hundreds of prisoners to death, who had suffocated dozens more in low-pressure chambers, who had shot test subjects through the chest to test blood-clotting tablets, this man was eliminated not for his crimes against humanity, but for embarrassing his patron with a fertility fraud. The Nazi regime never acknowledged the atrocities Rascher committed. They were embarrassed only by the lies he told about babies. When American forces entered Dachau on April 29, 1945, they found documentary evidence of the experiments that had been conducted there. photographs, medical records, the exodus tables, with their clinical enumeration of deaths. Survivor testimonies began to emerge, accounts from prisoners who had witnessed the ice vats, the outdoor freezing, the rewarming experiments. Some survivors had themselves been subjected to partial freezing before the experiments were interrupted or they were selected for other purposes. This evidence formed part of the prosecution's case at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, officially designated United States versus Karl Brandt et al., which began on December 9, 1946. 23 defendants faced charges, including counts related to murder, torture, and other atrocities committed under the guise of medical experimentation. Rascher himself was already dead, but his experiments were examined in detail as evidence of the systematic nature of Nazi medical crimes. The testimony was devastating. Dr. Leo Alexander, the American Medical Association representative who served as medical expert for the prosecution, methodically documented the experiments at Dachau and other camps. He described the freezing protocols, the rewarming methods, the crude assessments of tissue damage. He explained how the experiments had been designed, conducted, and recorded. He made clear that the perpetrators knew exactly what they were doing, that there was no possibility of claiming ignorance about the suffering inflicted. The defendants' responses varied. Some claimed they had acted under orders. Others argued that the prisoners were condemned criminals whose deaths served a greater scientific purpose. Still others maintained that the data gathered could save lives, German soldiers' lives at least, and that the ends justified the means. None expressed genuine remorse. The tribunal was unconvinced. 7 defendants were sentenced to death and executed. Others received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. The verdicts established a crucial legal precedent that medical experimentation without consent constituted a crime against humanity, regardless of the scientific value of the results obtained. From the evidence presented at Nuremberg emerged what became known as the Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 principles governing ethical human experimentation, drafted by doctors Leo Alexander and Andrew Conway Ivey. The code established requirements that seem obvious today, but had never been formally codified. Voluntary consent of the subject is absolutely essential. Experiments should yield fruitful results for the good of society. Unnecessary physical and mental suffering must be avoided. No experiment should be conducted where there is reason to believe death or disabling injury will occur. The code was never formally adopted into international law, and its principles were frequently violated in the decades that followed by American researchers in Guatemala, by Soviet scientists in the Gulag, by various governments pursuing biological weapons programs. But the Nuremberg Code established the moral foundation for modern research ethics, a direct response to the horrors documented in that German courtroom. What of the data itself? The question has haunted medical ethicists for decades. Rascher's hypothermia research, flawed as it was, represented the most comprehensive documentation of human physiological response to extreme cold ever compiled. No ethical researcher could replicate the experiments. No institutional review board would approve subjecting volunteers to the conditions Rascher imposed on his victims. The data existed, and in some cases it appeared to have potential applications for treating accidental hypothermia victims. The debate over whether to use this data has never been fully resolved. Robert Pozos, a physiologist from the University of Minnesota, and John Hayward from the University of Victoria, argued that the data could save lives and should be used. Others maintained that citing Nazi experiments legitimized the crimes that produced them. Arnold Relman, editor of the New England Journal of Medicine from 1977 to 1991, refused to publish any article that referenced the Nazi data. In 1990, Robert Berger published a comprehensive review of the Dachau hypothermia experiments that largely settled the scientific question, if not the ethical one. Berger concluded that Rascher's data had all the ingredients of a scientific fraud. The experimental protocols were inconsistent. The measurements were unreliable. There was evidence that Rascher had falsified results to please his superiors. The data, Berger wrote, cannot advance science or save human lives. The verdict was grimly appropriate. The experiments that had caused so much suffering were not merely unethical, they were also scientifically worthless. Rascher had tortured and eliminated hundreds of human beings to produce data that no competent researcher would trust. The great irony of the Nazi medical experiments was that they combined maximum cruelty with minimum scientific value. But the legacy extended beyond questions of data quality. The Nazi experiments fundamentally changed how the medical profession understood the relationship between science and ethics. Before Nuremberg, the dominant assumption had been that the pursuit of knowledge was inherently good, that scientific progress justified significant sacrifices. After Nuremberg, the medical community was forced to acknowledge that science without ethical constraints was not science at all. It was simply organized brutality with better record-keeping. The freezing experiments at Dachau also illuminated something disturbing about human nature: the capacity of educated, professionally trained individuals to commit atrocities when given institutional permission and ideological justification. Rascher was not a monster in the conventional sense. He had attended progressive schools, trained at respected universities, worked in legitimate hospitals. He had colleagues who respected him, a wife he apparently loved, ambitions that any academic would recognize. And yet, when offered the opportunity to experiment on helpless prisoners, he embraced it with enthusiasm, displaying creativity and diligence in the pursuit of cruelty. The same pattern appeared throughout the Nazi medical establishment. More than 250 German doctors conducted human experiments during the war. They were not aberrations or outliers. They were products of one of the world's most respected medical traditions, graduates of institutions that had produced Nobel laureates and pioneering researchers. Their willingness to participate in medical murder suggested that professional training alone provided no protection against moral catastrophe, that the Hippocratic Oath meant nothing in the absence of deeper ethical commitments. The survivors of the Dachau experiments, those who somehow lived through the ice baths and freezing nights and crude assessments of tissue damage, carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. Some testified at Nuremberg, others avoided discussion of their experiences entirely. The physical effects, chronic pain, circulatory problems, heightened cold sensitivity, persisted for decades. The psychological effects were even more lasting. How does one process the experience of being deliberately frozen by doctors who watched clinically as your body shut down? How does one trust medical professionals again after such betrayal? The Claims Conference on Jewish Material, Claims Against Germany, eventually established compensation programs for survivors of Nazi medical experiments, but no amount of money could restore what had been taken. The victims of Dachau's freezing experiments lost more than their health. They lost the fundamental assumption that doctors exist to heal. Standing in Dachau today, visitors can walk the grounds where the freezing experiments took place. The ice tanks are gone, the pressure chambers dismantled, the outdoor freezing sites unmarked. What remains is the architecture of horror, the barracks, the crematorium, the watchtowers, and the weight of historical memory. More than 1 million visitors come to the Dachau Memorial each year, walking the same paths that prisoners walked, standing in spaces where unspeakable things occurred. The memorial includes documentation of the medical experiments, though the full horror is difficult to convey in museum displays. How do you exhibit the sound of screaming men freezing to death? How do you display the clinical detachment of doctors who watched their subjects die and then recorded the data for future presentations? The experience of visiting Dachau is one of confrontation with the limits of human evil. not the chaotic evil of warfare, but the organized, rationalized, documented evil of industrial atrocity. The story of Sigmund Rascher and his freezing experiments is ultimately a story about the fragility of civilization. The same German society that produced Beethoven and Goethe, that pioneered modern research universities, and established some of the world's leading medical institutions, also produced Dachau and Auschwitz, and the Nuremberg trials. The line between civilization and barbarism proved thinner than anyone had imagined, crossable by ordinary professionals pursuing career advancement and institutional approval. Rascher himself remains a figure of historical fascination and revulsion. His correspondence with Himmler reveals a man constantly seeking approval, constantly exaggerating his achievements, constantly positioning himself for advancement. He was simultaneously ambitious and mediocre, cruel and professionally conventional. In another era, he might have been nothing more than an unsuccessful academic, a researcher whose work never achieved significance. The Nazi regime gave him unlimited subjects, absolute power over their lives and deaths, and a patron who rewarded results without questioning methods. Under these circumstances, his mediocrity metastasized into monstrosity. The final irony of Rascher's life was his death. The man who had frozen prisoners to death, who had suffocated them in pressure chambers, who had shot them to test blood-clotting agents, this man was executed not by the liberating Allies, but by his own SS comrades on orders from the patron he had served for years. Himmler, facing Germany's collapse, had no interest in leaving witnesses to his complicity in Rascher's crimes. The doctor who had exploited the concentration camp system was eliminated by that same system when his usefulness ended. 3 days later, American soldiers walked through the gates of Dachau and found what remained: the records, the survivors, the evidence of crimes that would shock the conscience of the world. The experiments ended, but their legacy endured in the nightmares of survivors, in the ethical frameworks developed to prevent repetition, in the fundamental question they posed to the medical profession and to humanity itself. What are we capable of when we decide that some lives don't matter? The answer, documented in Rascher's meticulous records, was everything. We are capable of everything.